Hockey is unlike anything else in the world of sports. It's fast, it's brutal, it's beautiful. Players glide on thin blades of steel at 20 miles an hour, smashing into each other with bone-rattling force. Pucks rip through the air at over 100 miles per hour, turning frozen rubber into a weapon. Sticks are swung, tempers flare, and chaos feels like it's only a heartbeat away. But out of all this madness, one thing makes hockey stand apart from every other major sport on Earth. A phenomenon so unique, so controversial, that fans either can't get enough of it, or believe it has no place in the modern game: the fight. In hockey, players aren't just allowed to fight. For over a century, it's been built into the very DNA of the sport. Two men throwing off their gloves, squaring up in front of thousands of screaming fans, and trading punches until one of them collapses to the ice. No other league in the world treats fighting this way. But how did hockey become the sport where violence is not only tolerated, but institutionalized? Why has fighting lasted for so long when nearly every other sport has outlawed it? And perhaps most importantly, why are so many saying that fighting in hockey could be coming to an end? To understand fighting in hockey, you have to go back to its chaotic origins. When the game first started being played in the late 1800s, it was a free-for-all. Imagine a group of young men swinging heavy wooden sticks on frozen ponds with no helmets, no referees, and barely any rules. Hockey wasn't just rough. It was deadly. By the early 1900s, things had gotten so out of control that players were actually dying. In 1904 alone, 4 different men lost their lives in violent incidents on the ice. Brawls, stick swings to the head, uncontrolled melees. The sport had a reputation for mayhem. When the National Hockey League was founded in 1917, its leaders faced a dilemma. How could they bring order to the game without killing the excitement that drew fans in? They knew they couldn't eliminate fighting completely. If they tried, players would still fight anyway, and fans would still cheer for it. So in 1922, the NHL made a groundbreaking decision. They codified fighting into the official rule book. The word they used was fisticuffs, and instead of throwing players out of the game, they gave them a 5-minute penalty. That was it. Sit in the penalty box, cool off, and then come back to play. It was revolutionary. Other sports banned fighting immediately. Hockey embraced it. The reasoning was simple. Boxing was one of the most popular sports in the world at the time. People loved controlled violence, and hockey's leaders realized they could use fighting as a marketing tool. If boxing filled arenas, why not hockey fights? But there was another, deeper reason. Fighting gave the sport a way to police itself. With tempers boiling and sticks being swung like weapons, fights acted as a safety valve. They prevented even worse violence, because players knew that if they crossed the line, someone would make them pay. And this is where the culture of the code was born. If you've ever heard hockey players or coaches talk about fighting, you've probably heard the term the code. It isn't written down anywhere, but it's as real as any rule in the NHL. The code says that if you take a cheap shot, if you slash someone across the wrists, if you hit a star player from behind, or if you play dirty, you're gonna have to answer for it. And that answer doesn't come from the referees, it comes from the players themselves. For decades, the code kept order on the ice in a way no penalty could. Players knew that if they went too far, someone would drop their gloves and make them pay. And unlike a stick to the back of the head, a fist fight was seen as an honorable way to settle things. 2 men would square up, fight it out, and once it was done, the game would move on. Without fighting, many players argued the game would actually become more dangerous. If cheap shots went unanswered, players would swing sticks more often, throw blindside hits more recklessly, and injure opponents in ways far worse than a black eye or a broken nose. And so, the code became hockey's unspoken constitution. It wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. And the men who enforced the code became legends in their own right. They were called enforcers, or goons, or in more respectful terms, the policemen of the ice. These were the players who weren't there to score goals, set up beautiful plays, or skate like the wind. They were there to make sure nobody touched their teammates without paying a price. Names like Bob Probert, Tiger Williams, Tia Domi, and Georges Laraque still send shivers down the spines of those who remember them. They were some of the toughest men to ever lace up a pair of skates. If you were an opposing player and you saw Probert on the other bench staring at you, you thought twice before throwing that extra cross-check. If you lined up against Ty Domi at a face-off, you knew that one wrong move could land you flat on your back. The Philadelphia Flyers took this idea to the extreme in the 1970s. Known as the Broad Street Bullies, they built an entire team identity around toughness and intimidation. They didn't just play hockey, they fought, bullied, and intimidated their way to 3 straight Stanley Cup finals, and they won 2 of them. The rest of the league noticed. Suddenly, teams realized that intimidation was just as valuable as scoring goals. Enforcers became a staple of nearly every roster, but fights weren't just about protecting star players, they became a weapon to change the energy of a game. Not every fight in hockey comes from a cheap shot or dirty play. Sometimes they're planned. 2 enforcers would skate around each other, jawing back and forth, waiting for the right moment. Then suddenly, the gloves hit the ice. The crowd would erupt, the players would circle each other, and the fight would begin. Other times, it was right off the face-off. Before the puck even touched the ice, both players knew what was coming. They'd drop their sticks, grab each other, and throw punches until one went down. Why would they do this? Simple. Momentum. Hockey is a game of emotion as much as skill. One fight could wake up a sleepy team, bring a dead crowd to life, and completely flip the flow of a game. Coaches would even send out their enforcers when their team was down by a couple of goals, hoping a fight would spark a comeback. And it worked. Over and over again, teams rallied after fights. Some even rode the emotional wave all the way through a playoff series. But if staged fights electrified the game, full-on brawls turned it into pure chaos. Some fights are forgotten as soon as they happen, others become legend. In the 1970s and 80s, brawls were a regular occurrence. Canadiens versus Bruins, Flyers versus Islanders, Oilers versus Flames. These weren't just hockey games, they were battles. One of the most infamous moments came in 1979 when the Boston Bruins actually climbed into the stands at Madison Square Garden and fought the fans. Yes, you heard that right. Bruins forward Mike Milbury even beat a fan with his own shoe. Then there was the punch-up in Pistani in 1987. Canada versus the Soviet Union in a junior tournament. A bench-clearing brawl so out of control that officials couldn't stop it. Eventually, arena staff turned off the lights to get the players to stop fighting. In the late 1990s, one of the greatest rivalries in NHL history was born. The Colorado Avalanche versus the Detroit Red Wings. It started with a devastating hit from Claude Lemieux on Chris Draper, and it exploded into years of hatred. There were line brawls, goalie fights involving Patrick Roy, and blood spilled in every game. Fans still talk about it to this day. These moments weren't just sideshows, they became part of hockey lore, stories passed down from one generation of fans to the next. But as unforgettable as those brawls were, they also marked the peak of an era, because slowly the numbers started to change. In the early 2000s, fighting began to decline. At first, it was gradual. A few less fights here, a few less enforcers there. But then the numbers dropped sharply. Between 2008 and 2019, fighting fell by 70%. In the 2018-19 season, there were just 224 fights. Compare that to nearly 300 the year before, and thousands in decades past. And the trend is undeniable. Why? For one, junior leagues started cracking down. In the Ontario Hockey League, players could be suspended after just 3 fights. In the British Columbia Hockey League, only 2 fights were allowed before extra discipline. That meant fewer young players coming into the NHL with a role as pure enforcers. If you couldn't score or skate, you weren't getting drafted. Another major factor, concussions. As science advanced, the dangers of repeated head trauma became impossible to ignore. Stories of former players struggling with depression, memory loss, and worse began to surface. Lawsuits were filed. Public opinion shifted. Suddenly, fighting didn't look like an entertaining spectacle. It looked like a liability for players, for teams, for the entire league. And yet the debate raged on. Many players still believed fighting was essential, but the world outside hockey wasn't sure anymore. So here's the question, is fighting in hockey on borrowed time? There are plenty of reasons to think so. First, the modern NHL doesn't value enforcers the way it used to. Teams are built on speed, skill, and scoring. A player who can't skate at a high level but can throw punches just doesn't fit into today's game. Second, the league itself has made it harder to fight. The instigator rule means you can't just jump someone who threw a dirty hit. If you do, you risk an extra penalty and an ejection. That takes away a lot of the power enforcers once had. Third, there's the business side. Owners, sponsors, and TV networks don't want the image of hockey to be endless fistfights. They want goals, highlights, and superstar skill. As the NHL tries to grow internationally, out in Europe, Asia, and beyond, fighting is harder to justify. Fourth, the health crisis can't be ignored. With every new story of CTE, every former fighter who struggles after retirement, the pressure builds. The league can only ignore it for so long before lawsuits and public pressure force a change. And finally, the culture is shifting. Younger fans aren't growing up watching line brawls and bench clearing fights. They're watching Connor McDavid fly down the ice, or Austin Matthews snipe top corner. Skill is the future. Add all of this together and the case is clear. Fighting may not vanish overnight, but its days could be numbered. So will fighting ever truly disappear? Not yet, not completely. Fights still happen, they still ignite crowds, they still act as a pressure release valve when games get too heated, and as long as players feel that cheap shots need to be answered, fighting will remain part of the game. But the trend is undeniable. Fights are rarer than ever, enforcers are almost extinct, and the NHL's identity is shifting towards speed and skill. Maybe one day, fights will be as rare as bench clearing brawls are now. Once legendary, but mostly a memory, or maybe they'll survive in some form, tied forever to the culture of the sport. As Rodney Dangerfield once joked, "I went to a fight the other night and a hockey game broke out." But maybe in the not so distant future, fans will say something else. "I went to a hockey game and no fight broke out at all."